The Witcher, Hexer, Chapter 14. The Days of Divisional War. All who had a breath of a soul left in their body felt the calling of their true spirit in those days. Nothing could be said other than the obvious. The division called for action, action against either side. It is rumored that the game of chess was invented in those days by the inspiration the Divisional War created, but that was just a rumor, since the age-old game was even older than these times. The comparison was fantastic. Although Geralt and Yennefer were outcast king and queen in their own right, they were playing off the board, one could say. The time came when Trilzum's offspring, given seed with Queen Ciri, were full grown, and it didn't take much time at all. These new monstrous beings were the worst monsters everyone wanted to forget existed once the war was over. Surely they were exterminated quicker than any other hybrid species that had crossbred, only their devastation during their short time living was also far greater than any other monsters before or after. Out of the sea, the Cetrals flew. Cetrals were their given name in honor of their father Trilzum. Queen Ciri's vengeful wrath was amplified, and the ocean around her boiled from her intense hatred. Geralt of Rivia was given a new potion concocted by Yennefer. This was for hyper-vigilant focus. His senses became more like that of the White Wolf. His beard began to grow faster, and he was now shaving twice a day, once in the morning during sunrise and again in the evening at sunset. Geralt shaved because if he did not, the beard would get in the way of his potions and elixirs he wore about his neck and the vials that decorated his chest. If he let it grow longer than that, then the long beard really would disable him in his combat techniques as a swift swordsman. Geralt heard the Cetrals coming long before anyone else did. Geralt at this time was mastering the art of flight. She could soar across the treetops, but not much higher than that, because her concentrated energy was almost being spread too thin. Even so, Yennefer was strengthening herself to become so powerful that she could hover in the same way Trilzum used to hover. Even still, Yennefer did not notice the coming of the new monsters until Geralt warned her. "Yennefer, did you see them? Do you see them?" Geralt looked up at her in his heightened alertness. "Who do you refer to, Geralt? I'm confused as to whom you ask." Yennefer seemed to look down in bewilderment, puzzled. "The monsters. They came from the sea, and now they fly our way towards you, towards us. I just thought you could see them by now." Geralt began to realize his senses were heightened much more than he anticipated. "Your reach has grown farther. You are the White Wolf, Geralt, as the old druids prophesied." Yennefer was reassured that she had done well in her witchery and picking. "I will cut them down. You must tell me when you can see them. I hear them coming with great speed, as the wind is carrying their howling." Geralt seemed distressed from this anxiousness to kill the monsters. "I will let you know as soon as I see them, Geralt. Your animalistic senses are far greater than mine, even in my power to see." Yennefer expressed her impression. "Thank you. What you have done with your work, I can never repay you. You've made me better than I could have achieved alone." Geralt gave his heart's truth to his love. "This is true, Geralt, as well as these words hold true for thine presence in my life." Yennefer gave her poetic sentiment archaically. "I will go forward as my ears guide me this way in the direction you give your sight. Please, let me know if you see anything before I am aware." Geralt gave his final wish to his love before battle came roaring into him. "I don't think that's going to happen, Geralt, but you have my word. I will bring down fire before you to see regardless." Yennefer gave a satisfactory sign in agreement. With the whole land of peoples behind him, Geralt led the people cautiously into the forest. Clever craftsmen and women worked together, building elaborate mechanisms for defense that would be critically pivotal in their victory. Instrumentally, these complex contraptions built from the resources of the dense forest kept the monsters in the dark, symbolically, with mirage-like illusions. Many walls were made to direct the monsters a certain way, and the view from above would not differ from the intended confusion tactics implied by the master craft workers of the land. Plenty of skilled workers lended their talents they were gifted with. Putting their minds together collectively, the women and men of the forest built walls along the naturally grown trees. These walls were made from different pieces of the old fallen trees and limbs of trees, woven with vine and flexible switch-style branches. The abundance of ivy was used in majority, along with the various kinds of moss the wilderness so generously gave. These walls, as they were built to be woven into the natural landscape of the forest wilderness, was a work of art, and there was something sacred about their construction. These monsters went in like livestock through the gates to the slaughter pen. Geralt held his sword with both hands, ready to swing his mighty blade. Yennefer was correct in her assumption that she would not first become aware of the monster's presence before Witcher Geralt. His sword was an extension of his hands. Even through his strong gloves, Geralt of Rivia was given the gift of heightened sensation. The hairs on Geralt's knuckles tingled and became raised by his acute alertness. To Geralt's surprise, he heard the monsters on foot. The sea trolls were warned telepathically by a specific signal directly from Queen Cyrene, because she was warned by S. The Queen of the Sea was warned of the powers of the sorceress Yennefer. Once the sea trolls got close, Yennefer saw them, but Geralt already went charging forward, so she lost sight of the Witcher along with the heinous monsters. She sacrificed a small portion of the forest by throwing down fire, just as she said she would. Old trees burned up rather quickly, and she once again captured the view she was straining her eyes for. These monsters came flowing out of the trees as if they were of one mind in a steady flow. Geralt had his back against a tree that was as wide as his shoulder width. He felt as if he had been in this very same battle 1,000 times. Yennefer had this feeling as well, and they shared the weirdness together, yet alone in this moment as she hovered above the intense scene of the forest floor below. Unaware of the pulling of time, Geralt and Yennefer had only these notions of subtlety, like a feeling they could pass off as mere coincidence of battle fatigue. If the Witcher and Sorceress knew the whole truth of things, their heads would have exploded like the collision of the floating otherworldly continents of the past. Time indeed was pulled back by the unnatural occurrences from the events caused by Trilzum, and his aftermath he brought with him from the destroyed archaic constellations. These worlds of old were mostly destroyed for a reason, because if time would have allowed, there would have been more beings of higher intelligence like Trilzum, only more advanced, and this absolutely could not have been realistic for the cosmos to sustain sufficiently. Taken back to the battle, Geralt was there again, acting on pure, unadulterated, brutal instinct. The first monster he saw was severed in two just as soon as he recognized the thing was there. The way Witcher Geralt's senses were working now in these moments of battle were almost too intense for him, but he liked it. The new challenge was something freshly exciting for him, and he warmly embraced the experience, as these did not come very often in his long life. The first sea troll was split by its own velocity as it ran right into the sword in Geralt's hands. All the Witcher did was pivot in a graceful glide, rolling his back gently off the tree where he waited. This first kill sent shockwaves through the shared senses of the otherworldly hybrid monsters. The surprised dismemberment made the others rushing by in the woods jump back like spiders sensing a strong wind in their webs. Geralt was bringing more than a strong wind. Although the wind of his blade could be felt like the power of a falling tree behind bringing air to their face. This battle was like ones before, most definitely, with the new construction of paths in the forest, down to the tactics Geralt used with his back against the tree. Nothing on this scale, however. There was a monstrous genocide. Now, in these times during this battle, there was something happening that no one knew of concerning the Count. The ancient druid had taught his many followers in hiding how to tap into monsters' subconscious with a host spell, and the hexation acted like possession specifically for the otherworldly beasts. By doing this, he was risking the lives of each druid. The Count failed to mention this because he knew that mostly 9 of them would have agreed to go through with such a sacrifice. The Count promised the druids in training great power drained from the monsters they would inhabit, as the hateful creatures acted as hosts. Whenever they completed battle achieving death through the fighting monster, the Count told the practicing druids that the more successful they were in fighting the Witcher along with the benevolent side of the war, the more power they would receive. If they killed, then they would gain advanced wisdom for their magical powers. In truth, the only thing that would happen would be 2 things that none of the Count's followers wanted. Not only would his manipulated followers be killed along with the dying monsters they were tricked into attaching their spirits with, but those spirits would leave the soulless beasts upon death. This meant that the human souls had to go somewhere. The Count configured an elaborate spell that would redirect the soul into his permanent possession, strengthening his evil dark magic. These days of the Divisional War had been the testing platform in which stages were set in all places between the sides. Critical trials were necessary in order to determine who would lead the 4 corners of the earth. The Count eliminated the biggest threats to his domination, making him the elite master of darkness within the magical underground world of shadow. He found a way to fight Geralt, Yennefer, and the good armies of man, along with all benevolent ones who fought with them. The Count was able to shorten their numbers with the battle that stretched its ugly arm across the large continent where Geralt called home. Not only this, but he eliminated his largest threat of all the monsters by having them controlled. By this controlled hosting of these monsters by his apprentices in Druidism, the Count eliminated the sorcerers who potentially had enough power to overtake him, seizing his powers and his secrets. The Count didn't think to die, since this escaped his mind long ago, in his gain of power through the blackest of black magic. Instead, the Count fumed to himself in his hidden wrath he held in his blackened, hardened heart of stone. So, when the Count's faithful followers died behind the scenes, it was Geralt, Yennefer, and their armies who sent them to the grave unknowingly. Above Geralt, Yennefer hovering as long as she could stand looking above, until anxiousness outweighed her patience during the escalating battle. Yennefer felt helpless above, after throwing the fire down onto the forest. This was not how she wanted to be participating in the fight. She understood the reasoning of the sea trolls, realizing exactly why they chose to go down to Earth when they easily could have flown. There was something personal about ground combat compared to the impersonal airstrike. Some of the sea trolls chose to fly at first when encountering the Witcher's armies. Their primal instincts brought their feet to the ground. Once Yennefer's feet made contact again with the ground after hovering above the treetops, she understood the animalistic urge. There was a need to fight with feet on the ground. Yennefer gave shorter but more powerfully hot bursts of fire that were immaculately controlled from her hands, as her fists acted as torches of sorts that kept extending in flame. The amazing occurrence after Yennefer's decision to fight the monsters so methodically benefited Geralt and their army immensely. Fighting with fire as Yennefer chose, since it was her most powerful attack, created waves of explosions throughout the incoming sea troll monsters. The gaseous emanations from their father's inherited genetics caused explosive bursts of fire throughout the rushing in of the sea troll beasts. Geralt had one single vial of protection similar to the magic S used as a type of invisible wall around the borders of the forest castle. Geralt of Rivia threw the special vial down hard on the ground, then stepped on the broken pieces, shuffling his boot around the broken shards of glass until he flicked his foot up to kick the mess out of harm's way. While Geralt did this, his blade cut through in a prism-like manner through the fire. The blade's reflective properties became enchanted through the fire that glazed the magical potion and created a peculiar effect no one could have predicted. The sword's reflection became physical through an extra-dimensional bypass of physical properties, which sliced through every direction around him. It was a good thing his followers were far behind him at this moment, because the protective spell only covered the radius around Geralt and Yennefer. As the thousands of children of Trilzum and Queen Sari came flooding the forest, they were met with fire from Yennefer's hands, and a sword strike from Geralt's attack that baffled all who witnessed the spectacle. There were flashes of the White Wolf's steel going in every direction all at once. These sea troll creatures, as they resembled an upright human form, were reduced to mince meat and incinerated to a bloody boil in a matter of minutes. All the 1,000 original children were slaughtered by Geralt and Yennefer's hands alone. The many thousands of those original children of the original monsters had kept the battle going through the night, as they began to jump up in the trees with flight, then continued to swoop down like predatory birds too cowardly to fight an otherwise apex predator. Geralt embraced this magic as he was consumed in battle. His sword continued to cut through 1,000 sea troll monsters that day, while Yennefer burned around the same number of them, as the cowardly creatures screamed at an extremely annoying rate. The screams of the sea trolls sounded unnatural because it was like a suffocating inhalation, repeated back and forth with a quick outward choking sound, almost like a cough if someone had water trapped in their lungs. When the magic wore off his blade, Geralt began kicking the many monsters back that poured down on him from the surrounding trees. They began knocking down the walls that were made to direct them into slaughter. At first, this was bad for the armies that followed Geralt and Yennefer because the chaotic path these monsters rushed in was spastic and claimed a few casualties. Only for a moment, though, after the initial breaking and knocking down of those walls, since the guards were prepared to make their formation of diamond-like shield barriers. The elves and many dwarves who were with the knights, guards, and civilian people fighting from the forestlands began launching themselves over the human wall of shielded troops with elf magic. They had winged boots that were blessed with the hexation of flight from the birds that were the elves' friends. Elves had a special relationship with birds, as they could speak to them naturally like second nature, so when a bird would die that was friends with an elf, their entire bird family would give them blessing in spirit. Over time, the spirit power became so great that it lifted an elf from his feet who had saved his bird friend's wings after the bird died of old age. This is the story of the first elven flight with winged boots. It was not the actual flapping of wings that made them fly, but enchantment of spirit because of their special bond from the early peoples of the forest. Gnomes were making the monsters trip and fall all over themselves, which was quite the sight to see, especially when the dwarves began smashing monster brains out of the smashed skulls once the cetral heads hit the ground. Dwarves are especially good at smashing and splitting skulls in two. The elves prevented any more casualties from the cowardly tactics of the cetrals. Those masterful elves countered the swooping monsters by flying upwards with the points of their swords perfectly angled for the monsters to land on. Once they would catch on their swords, the elves would let their swords temporarily drop to the ground along with the dead beast carcasses, and the dwarves had a field day destroying the fallen monsters' skulls. Gnomes were content tripping the monsters and laughing all the while doing so. The guards and knights stayed strong in keeping their barriers tight with their shield walls. The ones on horseback stayed along the sidelines, steering in the cetral stragglers who tried to flee from their slaughtered piles. Geralt began to enjoy looking back at the messes of monster corpses. He turned back and looked behind them after he saw Yennefer no longer had to fight. Geralt had noticed that Yennefer had turned to look behind them first when he heard her let out this sort of giggled girlish laugh that she tried to suppress with no luck, of course. They watched, admiring the monster slaughter for a good while they caught their breath from such a good workout. Geralt could not differentiate one battle from the other more often than not, since so many ran together in his mind after so many hundreds of years. This was the same conundrum for his love, the sorceress Yennefer. The two had been living in this type of untreated, continuous, dramatic state of perpetual battles within their psyche in every way that bled out into their physical realities, and living this kind of life day in and day out with no end became a private hell for the both of them. If Borch could understand the depth of such kindred spirits between such as Geralt and Yennefer, then he might have never been filled with such bitter resentment concerning the wishes of his selfish, prideful heart. This, like any man, would be his downfall. Borch kept that secret hidden deep within since the day he secretly threw the coin against the rocks to cause the avalanche. In his heart of hearts, Borch made the wish to cause that terrible avalanche, hoping to kill Yennefer in the process so that his daughters might have Geralt for their husband. Now all Borch could do was faithfully fight for their cause, as he had to keep this shame all to himself. The bard found a safe place high above the biggest and first battle, which would end the fight for land between the monsters and men. Jaskier was in the highest tree, in a type of pirate's lookout nest. He played a somber tune that echoed throughout the plain of the theater. Looking down on this day, what a fine sight you'd see. My heart's made content with the blood and misery of many, not for man or elf or gnome, no, not for the dwarf or giant that's known. My joy that I sing of is for darkness's fall. Geralt the Witcher led the monster's fall. This was his call, to brawl amongst all, while the guards kept strong their shielded wall. The knights stayed true to their oath of the forest, and as the sun came down, so did the battle. The time has now come to sing victory, for the sorceress burned down 1,000 of them. Led by their hatred for all that is good, monsters were slaughtered, as they very well should. The people of the forest, we knew they could. The ones from afar, we all knew they would. Many secret casualties piled up in the secret hidden quarters of evil darkness. The many chambers of the Count were far and wide, spread out beneath the many underground realms that were connected tunneled cities under the large forest continent. The stench of death crept out into the land, and monsters went to feast upon the rotted scent deep beneath the forest lands. This caused more monsters to die once they ate of the cursed flesh of the sacrificed druids. This heaping of killed monsters gave a sense of entitlement to the Count, realizing he was responsible for the deaths of many wicked beasts and sorcerers alike. In the Count's twisted mind, he thought he should be given the land to rule over. Those endless years of tyranny in the darkness twisted the Count's perception of reality far more than anyone could have ever imagined. This made him eventually come to the surface, into the light, to infect the land with his true evil. The true number of casualties in the Divisional War could never be numbered. After that first day, once Geralt, Yennefer, and their armies slaughtered the 1,000 original offspring of Trilzum and Ciri, along with their countless thousands, the slaughter kept on going on for the rest of the week, as the elves led an incredible crusade. Flying over the land, the elves from Divina Calicata searched for the remaining sea trolls who made it to land. With Yennefer in the middle of them, the elves protected her as their queen, and she rained fire down in the form of balls like comets and burning hail. Those sea troll that remained on land lived their last efforts killing all they could who were on their way to the shore. Some innocent families were killed, but not many, although even one was a hard burden put on Geralt and Yennefer's armies. This sank each person's heart as one, realizing that the cause of the innocent one's deaths lay on the consciences of those who left their very own children and wives back at home so they could fight. All understood and the eldest giant couple would share their story to those who wept as consolation, letting them know of their sorrow and why they chose to fight after losing children and children's children. Through the celebration of defeating the hybrid terrors Trilzum seeded, Geralt's armies also wept for the fallen, and for those innocent women and children who were torn apart in fleeing from their crusades. There were few dry eyes among the thousands of good peoples, and it were mostly due to the battle shock one experiences in the throes of war trauma. If it weren't for Geralt's courage, none would have followed. If it weren't for the strengthening of the White Wolf's blood from Yennefer's dedicated spells, then Geralt would not have had such strength to build his bravery. The two were bonded stronger in those days of the Divisional War, and once again, Borch had to accept it. This bothered Borch more than it bothered his own daughters, which he wished Geralt to originally marry before he knew of Yennefer's existence. The more Borch fought beside them for Yennefer's cause for Geralt, the stubborn man grew grudgingly fond of the sorceress. He hated himself for it, but this made the guilty man wise, for his warrior daughter's sake. Tia and Vea were wiser than their age. They knew something was wrong when they realized that no one was seeing many monsters like before of the many other kinds. They were still running into some, but not nearly as much as they expected. When the smell of the dead became strong from the openings in the earth, the gnomes knew where it was coming from. The bravest of dwarves went in to look, going ahead of the gnomes, minus a couple of the leaders of the gnomes actually leading the way in the cavern tunnels. This occurred about a week and a half after the battles were over during the Divisional War. They were stunned to see what they saw in those caves, lit by their lanterns. None had explored these places for many hundreds of years, ever since the Count and the evil druids took them over after the expelling of the dwarves and gnomes from the land. This was a tough thing for the dwarves and gnomes to recall, since they heard the stories all their lives that were passed down from their parents as a way to protect them from the evil below Divinicalcata. Weakness was not a part of their mentality, so this was difficult for the brave dwarves and gnomes to stomach. A beautiful thing happened, though, through this. The message was received into the ears of those who went deep in those caves to see the dead druids and monsters. Some of those who fell into the ocean, who were taken in the vortex whirlpools, went from the new kingdom that was binge-ruled, now from Pavetta and Duni's wishes. Those many dwarves and gnomes went by the elves' command, who stayed behind to protect Pavetta and Duni in the palace. It would be known that many more were slain in the underworld, almost all the rest of the Cetral offspring. Geralt and Yennefer learned once those gnomes and dwarves came back up that there was this wonderful new palace that had prevailed against the raging Queen of the Sea, Queen Cyree. How wonderful of news amidst all the death and bloodshed and rot. They were able to cover up those old tunnels of their ancestors, and the great gnomes and dwarves of Divinicalcata gave remembrance by honoring their humbled ancestors by converting those ancient cave homes stolen long ago into tombs. They let Yennefer use her fire magic to enrich their lamps and torches, leaving them to burn out the dead druids and piles of monsters who came to feed off the cursed flesh. After this ritual was complete, the dwarves worked hard along with the gnomes to seal off those sacred tombs, once they found bones of their ancient elders. Mourning lasted a day, and once that day was granted to all to pay their respects, with the blessing of Geralt the Witcher, Yennefer gave an announcement to the armies who had been with them. You are free to go as you wish. The battles of the Divisional War are over. Never again shall we see such a time of division. We know now the evils that are among us, for the most part, and the remaining Naga shall be found. The remaining monsters shall be found also. You've made them flee to the furthest corners of the land and driven them to the sea and to the pits of the underworld. To the burning pits they shall go. Now go and do as you wish. Yennefer caught great applause. Geralt spoke to add to her kind words addressing the people. If you wish, you may join us in this 3-day feast we shall hold here in the theater. You have saved your land, and now you deserve all the spoils, and anyone who dares to defy my words against you, bring them to me. The crowd of people were very pleased with Geralt of Rivia, along with what Yennefer had said. There was a 3-day feast, with no interruption, which no one could believe once all was said and done. Many expected some other terrible calamity to come along, from the likes of the underworld druidic creature S or Queen Cyree, but nothing like that happened, to many surprise. There was only a 3-day period of joyful celebration to forget their worries, as they knew more insidious and clever evils were to come, from the likes of the ones they knew of, let alone the ones they only could speculate over. Thus concludes the accounts of the great battles of the immense divisional wars, as much was not accounted for, since the benevolent beasts of the sea who fought and killed the majority of those numbers of the malevolent beasts did not care to keep written accounts of their happenings, since they kept the old traditions of spoken accounts only between their kindred.